So, who is Hillary Cass? And people cover some of this on in the Dispatch article, but why don't you just sort of give an overview, take as long as you need, about why it's important and how sound is it?
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, the UK, after the Netherlands, probably has sort of the most well developed and organized system for youth gender medicine. There's a clinic called GIDS, Gender Identity Development Service. It's within the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust. They really like bureaucracy over there. There's a lot of different offices and names, and I can never keep everything straight. I'll just call it I'll just call it GIDS. GIDS is sort of the Youth Gender Medicine Clinic in England, and over the years they've realized that all is not well there. They, like everyone else, they saw an uptick of kids being referred to these services. It used to be this little specialty service where it was a tiny number of kids, which of course doesn't mean those kids don't deserve great care too, but it's just less important. If it's just a tiny handful of kids, like it's not going to get media attention. People aren't going to care that much about it. Then what happened in the 2010s is the number of kids showing up at gender clinics exploded exponentially, and overwhelmingly, or majority, natal female, whereas usually it had been mostly natal male showing up at these clinics. And no one really knows exactly why this is the case. The two competing explanations are that there's less societal stigma. So trans kids are more comfortable telling their parents, I'm trans, I'd like to go to one of these clinics and get medicine. The other explanation is it has something to do with social influence, peer contagion, things like that. And
it could be both, right?
of course, it's definitely not one or the other. I mean, and I've been surprised that some otherwise smart people who pretend that something like that can really just be one cause. Although I've been most surprised by people who claim that this is the one area of adolescent life where they're completely immune from influence from their peers or the culture. I mean, when is that true? Anyway, so GIDS, the British system, gets English system gets swamped with demand. Whistleblowers come forward. There's stuff going on. They're not all, on the one hand, not all kids are getting good assessments before they go on for puberty blockers and hormones. And I mean, should I dwell on that like assessment question for a sec? Do you get what I mean by that?
I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Okay. It's like this whole thing is a Russian doll of these like sometimes decades old debates, and in many cases, the people with, to my view, the incorrect answer to these questions have sort of won. Well, maybe the cast review will change that. So basically, kid shows up, says they're a boy, even though they look like a girl, or they want to be a boy. It really distresses them to do girl things or to be seen as a girl. What do you do with that? It depends a lot on their age. It depends on how long they felt that way. If you're going to put them on medicine rather than just socially transition them, you want to be pretty sure that this is like a durable part of their identity. If a kid at 8 says, I'm a boy, and by 10, they are sort of destined to revert back to being the girl they were born as, why would you mess with anything hormonally?
Right.
So, as these clinics get overwhelmed, and this has happened in both the States and GIDS, the clinic we're talking about, it's more and more difficult to give these kids in-depth assessments. There's a really long waiting list. A lot of kids are not getting good assessments. That's what whistleblowers start coming forward to say, whistleblowers who worked at GIDS. In addition, there's a lawsuit by this woman, Kira Bell. She's a 20-something girl who was transitioned to male fully within GIDS and then the adult service, and she sues them, saying she did not get the care she needed. Now, initially, there's a high court ruling or a court ruling saying that teenagers can't really consent to these treatments. That's reversed, but it shines a huge light on this issue. And the result of all of this is, to its credit, to the NHS's credit, there's this big review commission to just look at the whole thing, this whole youth gender medicine system, and figure out what's working well, what isn't, and how it can be improved. And the person tasked with this is Hillary Cass, who's a respected pediatrician.
And so, and her findings are essentially that there's, I mean, I'm trying to do it as a shorthand, that there's been a sort of a faddish rush a lot of motivated reasoning that overlooks that the evidence is much more mixed. That um, everyone who's getting gender assignment therapy should be. Is that fair to put it?
Yeah, I think she phrases it in a little more of a hedged way. I mean, she writes like a scientist, which I appreciate. It's always on the one hand, on the other hand, on the other hand. There is within JIDS, there appear to be some clinicians who are sort of true believers who really don't bother with assessment that much. That's one concern. Another concern is they don't have the resources to do assessment because of the waiting lists. It's just sort of an institution in total chaos. And Hannah Barnes, a former BBC journalist, wrote an amazing book called Time to Think that really captures this whole controversy in detail. I interviewed her on my podcast, but anyone who wants to learn more about this should read her book, because her book is absolutely a preview of what's going to happen in the States once we really find out, I think, what's going on in these clinics. But yeah, the Cass review, looked at all the evidence we have for youth gender medicine. Cass describes it as remarkably weak. And given the hedged way she writes and thinks, she chose those words for a reason, I think. They really jump off the page. Mm-hmm. So we're giving some kids these treatments on the basis of remarkably weak evidence. She makes all these recommendations, including that puberty blockers for under 18s are basically shut down now outside of research settings in England. There's this whole other sub-scandal about the lack of any sort of data being produced. So these treatments have been going on for about a decade and a half over there, and no one has really bothered to produce good data. In fact, the first study attempting to show that puberty blockers helped came back showing they didn't help. And the clinic responded, A, by basically suppressing that finding for years, and B, by expanding sort of the diagnostic criteria for giving kids blockers. So they get data showing these blockers don't really work. Let's give them to more kids. Let's not assess so carefully. So
can I stop you there for a clarification thing? When you say it didn't work or didn't help, what does work mean or help here? Is it mental health? Is it what is the problem to be fixed here, right?
That's a whole other sort of philosophical divide. But yeah, that's a really important question. So basically, these treatments started in the Netherlands. It was the Dutch clinic, as it's known, that first put kids on blockers, then hormones, and then usually they would get surgery after that. The Brits tried to replicate this early puberty blocker study from, I think, 2011. And whereas the Dutch found some improvements,
improvements in mental health?
Improvements in psychosocial outcomes, basically. Yeah. Except in 2018, I would have told you the Dutch study found improvements. Since then, people have gone back and read the study as thoroughly as I should have when I first started reporting on this. And it's actually much more of a mixed bag than that. Like, the Dutch study is now seen as some improvements, some missing data, some non-improvement. Either way, the Brits come at this from the position of this study shows puberty blockers work by improving kids' mental health. The idea is if you're a trans kid and you're on the cusp of puberty and it's going to cause all these permanent changes to your body, and everything I'm describing here is a very real thing that afflicts some people, and it's hard for you and me, being sort of avatars of perfect masculinity with perfect bodies, just sex symbols, to understand how that might feel to just be at war with your own body. That is undoubtedly real, and undoubtedly some people go through, and they absolutely deserve empathy and medical treatment if it will help them and when it will help them. But the Brits try to replicate this result, that puberty blockers will make kids feel better by giving them time to calm down and think through their options and not have to face puberty right away. And they find just no improvements in mental health. The one thing they found improvement is the kids who took the blockers reported being pleased that they had taken the blockers, but that doesn't really tell us much. There's a lot of studies showing that, not a lot. There's some studies showing you can basically give someone a sham treatment and then ask, "Are you happy you took it?" and they'll say yes. So,
if you burn your ships, there's a lot of motivated reasoning to say, "I'm glad I burned my ships." Right?
This is the new land. This is a bountiful land. Yeah. So yeah, it was basically a failed replication, and the part of this story I didn't understand until embarrassingly recently is how little they're there, just in terms of underlying studies supporting this whole approach. And it was just we can get more into those details. But the point is, the Cass review has now significantly restricted youth gender medicine in England, as well as changed the way it's delivered. One of the things Cass said is like there's this problem where doctors are so scared of gender issues because they're so toxic. So you, Jonah Goldberg, show up at my office as a 5-year-old and you once put on your mom's dress. The doctor goes, oh, we better get you to a gender clinic. And that's part of the reason for the wait list. Because like you, the doctor, are terrified that you're going to say the wrong thing and be reported. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little, but
no, I get it.
Cass talked about this culture of toxicity. So Cass basically, this is the less interesting to us bureaucratic stuff, but she basically shut down the central gender clinic and said, we'll have regional ones. And we're also going to make sure that the kids who end up at the regional ones have actual gender problems. Because a lot of this stuff, she thinks the first line should be therapy, basically, and exploring the gender issues rather than jumping quickly to puberty blockers or hormones.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to stop here because, like, the few times I've brought up this stuff or written about this, there's a tendency, I'm sure this is not news to you, there's a tendency on both sides to assume the other side are evilly motivated, right?
They want to kill, they basically want to kill children.
Right, that either they want to mutilate children or they want to have children suffer, denying them their true identity, and that the cruelty is the point, is what people very committed on one side or the other side. I have zero objection to the claim that a lot of these kids, some significant number of these kids, are in real distress, have real issues that need to be addressed, and that the people offering the gender affirming care stuff do not believe that they are doing wrong. You know, I mean, like, it's almost impossible. Once you think about it, it's this cartoonish, ridiculous way to think about the world, to think, okay, these guys just chose to be the bad guys, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, and this is not a great analogy, and you're free to push back on it all you like. You don't need even more trouble.
I hope it involves Hitler somehow.
No, Hitler.
Damn it.
I mean, I can go there, but like, what was the name of the scientist? Megan McArdle's written a bunch about him. The scientist who was convinced that lobotomies were the cure for all sorts of problems.
Oh yeah, this is what, like 30s and 40s in the U.S.
Yeah, the level of motivated reasoning that came with it was just so huge. You know, it's also like the Heimlich guy, right? The Heimlich guy got so much great attention for the Heimlich maneuver, he started to want to prescribe it for things other than choking. And you can see how people who have chosen what they think is this incredibly noble liberationist, affirming one's identity, helping kids, discover who they really are, kind of thing, how that's your hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, and you can see how that stuff could really run amok.
Yeah, and I think what's frustrating about this is, since the days of promiscuous lobotomies, we've developed like a tool set, or experts have developed a tool set to explain what constitutes good versus bad medical research. And Cass dug into that toolbox and commissioned these independent reviews, systematic reviews. And a systematic review is just basically, it's like if you open up a storage unit and there's a bunch of junk in there and you want to figure out how valuable it is. You need an expert to tell you if that lamp is an antique or if it was someone bought it at Target a decade ago. So the doctors publishing or touting these weak studies, there's no excuse in 2024 for them to not realize how weak some of these studies are and how little they really tell us about youth gender medicine. So the very useful, important thing Cass did was just look at all of them and really deliver this. I don't want to say it's like a final verdict, but it's hard to see how the people saying the evidence base is good could come back from this, because this also comes on the heel of similar, less ambitious efforts in places like Finland and Norway and Sweden, all of which have looked at this evidence and said there's almost nothing there. Not in the sense that there aren't studies, there are studies, but they're just very weak studies. And in the 21st century, we know that a very weak study on something doesn't really tell us much about that thing.
And so when you say weak, how are you defining weak?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to define weak. I'll give you one example. Like the New England Journal of Medicine published a study by this NIH-funded team looking at outcomes in 4 youth gender clinics. And before they published it, they did what's known as they published their so-called study protocol. The study protocol is a roadmap saying, it's almost like the outline if you're working on a magazine article. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. And this included 8 different variables of youth mental health. And their theory was when we put kids on hormones, it was a study of hormones, not blockers, these 8 variables will improve. That's in the study protocol. Final product published in the New England Journal of Medicine, 6 of those 8 variables disappear. They're nowhere to be found. We don't know if they went up, if they went down, what happened to them. That is a weak study because we have no idea how we should feel about the study if we saw those 6 variables and there's no explanation of where they went. And this study then subsequently gets written up as evidence youth gender medicine works. And that level of cherry picking, we now know, tells us nothing. And on top of that, this was a study of 319 young people who had been screened for screened for suicidality beforehand. 2 years later, 2 of them have killed themselves. And this is supposedly a treatment that fights suicide. So all these red flags that just weren't picked up in mainstream media accounts. And I was frankly surprised the New England Journal of Medicine would publish it without, at least asking the authors to explain what happened to those studies. So that's one example. Then there's traditional things, low sample sizes. There's a bunch of studies that draw on this big online convenience sample survey of trans youth, the United States Transgender Survey. So if you're taking data from a group of people who happily identify as trans at the moment, you're excluding detransitioners, you're excluding people who aren't happy with their transition. Obviously, if you're drawing on that sample, it can't really tell you much about whether these medical treatments work. So that's another example.
Yeah, a poll of all lottery winners find lotteries are good.
Exactly. Yeah.
So where do you just personally come down on the issue of the sort of mimetic contagion thing? Like, just looking back, like, I find it, and I know Cass makes a reference to this, but like, it is just wildly implausible to me that across cultures and across time, the stigma against being gender fluid, trans, whatever the language is, that stigma going away can singularly explain this wild, exponential growth in, not just in the sort of, just the whole sort of gender fluidity thing. It feels very much a social desirability thing. I mean, there are some schools now where, there's a minority of the kids who will identify as cis heteronormative or whatever, because it's just something it's uncool to say.
Yeah.
It's kind of boring to say, but I mean, I'm not trying to like taint the jury here, but where do you come down on it?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's undeniably the case. And this is something I've heard from clinicians, from some trans kids themselves, including one in my Atlantic article. It's obviously the case that in some communities, it gives you some degree of belonging or social cachet to be trans. And I think a lot of trans activists, especially older ones, get angry at that, and for understandable reasons, because from their point of view, they can remember in the 90s, like trying to find any doctor who would give them hormones and being afraid to walk down the street dressed the way they felt like they should be dressed. So it seems ridiculous to them that anyone would opt into this identity or gain anything rather than lose things from it. But the fact of the matter is there's been a sea change in American public opinion on all sorts of LGBTQ stuff. And none of this is to say if you live in small town Mississippi, you're going to be celebrated for coming out as trans, but it's just undeniably the case that in blue bubbles, yes, this is, but the other thing is, I mean, kids are so awash in different identities, including a lot that they don't really understand. So I've heard from parents of 10 or 11-year-olds announcing they're pansexual. I mean, and I think in a lot of these cases it's harmless, and a 13-year-old who comes out as non-binary is sort of the same as an 11-year-old who says they're pansexual, and a few months later it'll be something else, and it's just this sort of interesting time where they're exploring gender, they're exploring labels. So I'm most concerned by far with the smaller subset of kids who seek to medically transition. But I the idea that there's no level of peer influence or social contagion here, I think that's the radical theory, that this is the one area of adolescent life where kids aren't influenced by their peers.
Right. I mean, the analogy some people make is to Tourette's, right? There's clearly a condition called Tourette's.
Yeah.
Like, it's a thing, and some people suffer from it terribly. But then a couple years ago, there was like this Instagram fueled thing of sudden onset.
I think it was TikTok, but yeah.
Yeah, or TikTok, yeah, sudden onset Tourette's. And the problem, I think, some people sort of on my tribe or my former tribe, they want to say it's all the TikTok phenomenon.
Yeah.
And then the other side says, no, it's the TikTok phenomenon doesn't exist. And again, the Venn diagram just has to overlap. It has to be a both and thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing I should just say is like I am the last person in the world who should get to decide who counts as trans, but the fact is that within the LGBT community, trans is now basically anyone who says they're trans. It doesn't require transitioning. It doesn't require a name change. There's a lot of people who look like me and identify as non-binary and don't physically transition, and that's fine. But that's all the more reason to think there's some degree of social influence here, because it's not like Billy at 12 comes out as non-binary, so he has to radically change how he presents himself or get hormones or surgery. It's just a label that he then can sort of use. So it's just trans is at this point sort of pretty loosely defined.